Secret Doctrine as HPB's really magnum opus emerged. And you have an edition already, the Adyar edition or one of the other editions of it, and do not want therefore to buy the new edition, the 78 edition, which is the original pagination, but with corrections made, then I strongly recommend this booklet, which is really the introduction to the 1978 edition of Boris Dezerkov's corrected original edition, The Rebirth of the Occult Traditions. This is perhaps the most complete and authentic story of the writing of the Secret Doctrine, with all the facts and data and excerpts from various sources and so on with regard to the writing of the Secret Doctrine. H.P. really began writing it in 1885, before she left Adyar. She continued it in Germany, in Würzburg, where she was resident for some time, and on to Ostend in Belgium, and of course it was completed in London, and as I say, published in 1888. The story of the writing of it is absolutely fascinating, and there is no one who was more familiar with the history of it than Boris Dezerkov, who was her grandnephew, whose death a few years ago was the ending of an era, and so far as we know, the last living relative of HPB. So I strongly recommend The Rebirth of the Occult Tradition. There are also various works dealing with it. For example, many of the people who worked with her in the writing of the Secret Doctrine or its publication have commented on it, and this is reminiscences from those who worked with her, who were with her during that time, particularly the Countess Constance Wachtmeister, who was with her in Würzburg, Germany, and later she reminiscens about it. The others, the Keatleys, uncle and nephew, who really helped in putting it together, they tell about the writing of it. There are others that are also Mr. Judge, W.Q. Judge, and several others who really knew her and worked with her and so on. This is a fascinating book to read, Reminiscences, and is very, very interesting. There is, of course, an abridgment of the Secret Doctrine, if you want to get at just the principal points, without many of the references to the science and religion and other things of her day. The abridgment was prepared by two outstanding students, Elizabeth Preston, a member of the Society in England, who's since died, both of them are gone now, and Christmas Humphreys, an outstanding abridgment. A digest was done of the book by Ernest Wood. This is out of print, Secret Doctrine Digest, but someday may be brought back into print. Its chief drawback is that it does not give the specific pagination, the page references to the quotations. So one is not always certain whether it is Ernest Wood's commentary or the words of HPB. And I think someday, if a student will take the time to put in the references, then it will be an extremely valuable book. Undoubtedly one of the finest works that is an exposition of it in terms of the doctrines, that is the various ideas, the various grouping, the various topics and subjects, is the work by Geoffrey Barborka called The Divine Plan. And this is, I think, probably the finest exposition, commentary, that gives you the basic information in terms of the subjects treated, and always meticulously with references, which Ernest Wood does not give, but always very meticulous because Jeffrey was that kind of person. He followed that up with two later books, which are also of value, that deal particularly with the work on anthropogenesis, which is volume 2. The Peopling of the Earth and the Story of Human Evolution. These deal with the stanzas of volume 2. To me, the best commentary is a modern commentary by two people who were not members of the Society, but who look at the Secret Doctrine as authentic because it basically deals with stages of consciousness, and who approach it from what I would call the esoteric psychological point of view. That is, not the normal psychology, which might turn some people off, but the actual inner psychology, the growth of the individual. Man, the measure of all things, and man, son of man. The first one is perhaps the best commentary on the stanzas of volume 1, Cosmogenesis, by Sri Krishna Prem and Sri Madhava Ashish, two Englishmen who were really very, very deep students. The second, Man, Son of Man, is really Ashish alone because Prem had died, and is the commentary on the stanzas of volume 2, not quite, I think, with the same beauty and flow as Sri Krishna Prem's work in volume 1, in the first volume, but still very valuable. A compilation with regard to the Secret Doctrine was originally published as H.P. Blavatsky and the Secret Doctrine, Commentaries on Her Contributions to World Thought, and has now been reissued in a new up-to-date quest book with some additional essays added. Then there are those works. I should mention the one authentic work that we have from HPB's own class on the Secret Doctrine in London, in the form of questions and answers, is called Transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge. This was her own class, where she was asked questions that I suppose today some of us might ask, or we might wish that they had asked other questions, you see. But unfortunately, because her death occurred, this does not go beyond the stanza, shloka 7 of stanza 3. So she didn't get very far in it, you can see. There are a number of others. The works of Elizabeth Preston, Life and Its Spirals, The Earth and Its Cycles. A symposium that was held in 1984 on the Secret Doctrine with papers from various students. This was held in San Diego. Works that have been commentaries. This Dynamic Universe, which deals principally with Fohat, one of the great subjects, and the Ordered Universe, by members of the Theosophical Research Center in London. Edward Gardner's work. There are many others by Edward Gardner, pamphlets, but The Play of Consciousness, The Web of the Universe, now reissued as a joint publication. One of the finest, I think, one of our finest scholars today on the Secret Doctrine is Adam Warcup, who has been here at the Crotona School and is from England, and taking a particular theme, in this case, cyclic evolution, and based on the Secret Doctrine. Josephine Ransom, many years ago, in a series of talks at our national headquarters, in 1932, studies in the Secret Doctrine. This is out of print, but still is very valuable if you can find a copy. One of the very early commentaries is simply by two students, but this has been reissued by the Theosophical Publishing House, Theosophical Gleanings. And then some various commentaries. One of our finest students is Monsieur Lancry in France, and this has been translated from the French selected studies. Many of you will remember Dr. Alfred Taylor, who was, of course, head of the Crotona School for some years in the 1960s and was it into 70s? I think so. Dr. Taylor gave a number of courses here on the secret doctrine, and 2 small booklets, commentaries and analogies, which are based on his talks here at the school. And then one book that I will be referring to especially tomorrow by one of our keen researchers, David Regal, a member of the Society, who has been looking into the basis, the source, the origin of these remarkable stanzas, and feels that he has indeed identified the source of the stanzas on which the secret doctrine is based, and has published a preliminary analysis, as he calls it, of the books of Hugh Tate. This I will look at a little more tomorrow. So these are some of the works, many, many more that are available.
Well, Joy, what do you think of Robert Bowen's little book on...
I'll be referring to that, yes. Of course, one of the finest which tells how to study the secret doctrine are the notes that were left by one of her students, Commander Bowen, who took notes during her course, her classes, HPB's own classes in London, and presented her with the notes, and she said, yes, these are fine. And they are published in a little booklet, How to Study Theosophy. They are also published as the appendix to the very excellent compilation by Leonti Hoskins called Fundamental Principles of the Occult Philosophy, the Esoteric Philosophy. I'll be referring to those. Yes, I didn't bring, because there are a number of ways in which they have appeared, and they're excellent. Well, let's look briefly. Are there any other comments or any questions?
The book on the Transactions of Blavatsky, is that available? Or
Yes, the Transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge is still available, and it's also published in the collected writings. I've forgotten which volume, but it is available, the Transactions of the Blavatsky Lodge. An absolute essential to see how she answered some of these questions.
I'm curious what happened to volumes 3 and 4.
They were never, so far as has been identified, never published. She makes reference in these 2 volumes of this will be in volume 3, or this will be in volume 4, and so on. When she died in 1881, there were a lot of miscellaneous manuscripts, of course, that had not been published. Her literary executors, G.R.S. Mead and Annie Besant, took a number of these along with her esoteric papers and published them as the famous Volume 3, or perhaps infamous Volume 3, because it led to a great deal of controversy. Obviously, the material that she says herself will be in Volume 3 was not that material. Some of it may have been. But what she says, and whether this was hyperbole, that volumes 3 and 4 are almost ready, obviously exaggeration, because no such material was actually found on her death. But this was published as volume 3. It is quite evident from internal evidence that it should never have been published as volume 3 of the Secret Doctrine, because it included the esoteric papers given to her esoteric students, which was never intended, according to her own statements. It became volume 5 of the Adyar edition. By mutual consent of all those who really have looked at the Secret Doctrine, and at the time that Adyar agreed to the publication of the original edition as edited by Boris, it was agreed we would never again bring that into print as part of the Secret Doctrine, because it is not, and should not be confused with it. And therefore, a quest edition was brought out of all of those papers called the Esoteric Writings of H.P. Blavatsky. I meant to bring that along. And those are those materials. But the esoteric papers have now been published in full by consent of Rhoda Bernier, Dr. Timely, and various others who were involved in volume 12 of the collected writings. the very much edited version of the esoteric papers in the esoteric writings, that quest book, really truncates the teachings. And so the full publication was called for. The papers, the miscellaneous papers, have all been published now in volumes 12, 13, and 14 of the collected writings as posthumously published papers, which is where they rightly belong.
How about her letters?
The letters of H.P. Blavatsky are still to be published, and a member in Australia is now beginning work on them, which we are supplying the copies from here.
That should be valuable.
That will be extremely valuable, but that will be part of the collected writings. Well, let me turn then to this question of the mental position required for an understanding of the esoteric philosophy. First, I think we must recognize that language itself reflects consciousness, and that really all language is metaphor. We all use metaphor. All language is metaphor. Simply put, this means that a word is not the thing. Or to put it even more prosaically, cookbooks will never satisfy our hunger. All a cookbook can do is give us clues as to how we ourselves may ultimately fill the void in the physical body. It really is quite a good analogy, I think, for we're seldom interested in cookbooks, or even the dishes that may be produced from them when we are full. Similarly, new ideas have very little appeal for the mind that is already filled with its own preconceptions and its own opinions and content with being filled with how things really are. So there's little use, and I think we all recognize this, there's little use in propounding theosophical ideas to an individual whose mind is already fixed in scientific materialism or religious fundamentalism. And our minds become similarly fixed, even crystallized, if you like, in our own pet theories. And theosophical fundamentalism is just as mind-filling as any other kind of fundamentalism. Language, in other words, can both stuff the mind, giving it indigestion, or it can release the mind, stir up the mind, encouraging the perception of new ideas. So I think for a new mode of thought, first of all, we have to see words as doorways, as windows, rather than as walls. They stand for processes, not for things. We have to, in other words, walk through words, if you like, see through them to the realm of meaningfulness. And some who have worked with me as students will know that I am constantly pushing you to see what it means to glibly say this A equals B without understanding its meaning is, I think, to misinterpret the process that is involved. Now, the mode of thought of the late 19th century, when HPB wrote these volumes, was a mode that was firmly established in what I can only call thingness. This was indeed the preeminent mode of thought of the last century. In science, of course, this involved a method based on the complete and absolute objectivity of the universe as out there, a world to be examined, measured, analyzed, and broken into its constituent parts. In religion, it involved a literalness of understanding that the words of the Christian scripture meant precisely what they said, and all other religious texts were to be judged in the light of the Christian scripture. Very word comparative religion meant there had to be a comparison with something. And this is why the term comparative religion is seldom used anymore in universities. Because what did you compare it with? You compared it with Christianity, which obviously was the superior religion. And today they are departments of religious studies, generally. And I think we're getting away from this comparative thing. Now, the mode of thought, then, as I say, in religion and in science, both dealt with literalness, the sort of thing that Alice in Wonderland said, you know, a word means precisely what I say it means. And it's a thing, no more, no less. And in philosophy, let us look, therefore, at the realm of philosophy in the 19th century, when HPB was writing. It was a time of the ascendancy of the great philosopher of evolution, Herbert Spencer, a man who was indeed much shaped by his times, when philosophy was not so much to be differentiated from science, but seen as the coordination of all the sciences. And the positivism of Auguste Comte, for example, had found its natural home in England, taking its spirit from the life of industry and trade. Just as today, as I mentioned at the very outset, we take very much our vocabulary from science and technology of our time, so industry and trade gave the language of 19th century England. Actually, before Darwin, the concept of evolution was in the air. But it was Spencer who suggested that it could be applied to every field of study. HPB quotes Spencer on a great number of occasions, indicating her familiarity with his writings. For Spencer, mind and matter were equally relative phenomena, the double effect of an ultimate cause whose nature can never be known.
Who was a writer, Judge?
Spencer, Herbert Spencer. Every theory of the universe, whether religious or scientific, Spencer suggested, forced thought into the realm of the inconceivable. And so HPB could extrapolate from Spencer and point out, on page 15 of volume 1, the very outset, she says, his view, that is Spencer's view, brings him very near to the esoteric and Vedantan tenet. But at the same time, she would comment further that the unknowable of Herbert Spencer bears only a faint resemblance to the transcendental reality believed in by occultists. And when it came to his psychology, because he wrote a number of books, one of which dealt with psychology, she spared no words in criticism. The schools of Spencer and Bain, wrote HPB, are respectively positivist and materialist. So you see, but this was what was going on. Now she was equally familiar, we must acknowledge, with the German transcendentalists who had a tremendous influence on 19th century thought, for she quotes and comments on the ideas of Schelling, Fichte, and Hegel, and as well as of Kant, who was the father of German idealism, and indeed provided, Immanuel Kant, the pivotal turning point for all Western philosophy. Well, I'm not going to give you a course in 19th century philosophy. Indeed, it would be impossible to examine in detail the philosophical currents which flowed through the 19th century, but to suggest that it was the language of philosophical speculations, in addition to the language of the emerging scientific materialism and religious dogmatism, that constituted the vocabulary of the 19th century thought, and therefore was the mode of communication or the currency of communication that was available to HPB. These were the words. Now, today, our language has changed, and you may not realize, unless you examine it, how much our language has changed. And therefore, thought, which language is a reflection of thought. So she was endeavoring, remember, to translate into the vocabulary of her time ideas, concepts, principles, which formed the very foundation of a metaphysical system which had hitherto, up to that time, had only been transmitted in mystery schools under the veils of allegory and myth. So she constantly refers to these allegories and the Puranas, the Brahmanas, the myths of all the great traditions, Egyptian, Indian, Chinese, all of these traditions, the religious background, which was very much submerged of the Kabbalah and the Gnostic tradition, and so on. But she had to work within the cultural and cognitive limitations of her time. And we have to similarly work within the cultural and cognitive limitations of our age. Now, one aspect of the philosophical speculation of her day should be mentioned, since it has a bearing on the very subtitle of HPB's volumes. Immanuel Kant introduced the concept of a transcendental dialectic. We cannot know, he said, the thing in itself, Ding an sich in the German, but only as it appears to us as phenomena. And Hegel, pursuing Kant's thesis, saw a dialectical movement running through everything, a dialectical movement grounded in Kant's concept of relation. The most pervasive of all relations is that of contrast or opposition. Do you know light if you didn't know dark? Do you know night if you didn't know day? Do you know hunger if you didn't know, what it was to be filled? Do you know hot if you don't know cold? You see. So these contrasts. Reality for Hegel lies beyond the dialectic. For above all, he proposed, reality must be non-contradictory. But in the realm of phenomena, there is this triadic movement, thesis, antithesis, and a synthesis. Now, synthesis was more than merely a resolution of opposites. It was the emergence of a new order of truth, but an order which could contain within itself the possibility of a further dialectical movement. Now, it may be helpful, therefore, to recognize, and let me just quote a paragraph from Will Durant's Story of Philosophy, which may help us in understanding this. He writes that the Kantian philosophy, which announced itself as prolegomena to all future metaphysics, was by malicious intent a murderous thrust at traditional modes of speculation and a damaging blow to all metaphysics whatsoever. For metaphysics had meant, throughout the history of thought, an attempt to discover the ultimate nature of reality. Now men learned, on the most respectable authority, that reality can never be experienced. And this was the pervading thought stream. That it was a noumenon, conceivable but not knowable. That even the subtlest human intelligence could never pass beyond phenomena, could never pierce the veil of Maya. The metaphysical extravagances of Fichte, Hegel, and Schelling, with their various readings of the ancient riddle, had canceled one another into zero. And by the 1830s, the universe was generally conceded to have guarded its secret well. After a generation, and I love this statement by Will Durant, after a generation of absolute intoxication, that is, intoxication with the absolute, capital A, the mind of Europe reacted by taking a pledge against metaphysics of any kind. Now it was into that the secret doctrine appears. Onto this stage strode the commanding figure of H.P. Blavatsky, And with the publication in London and New York simultaneously in 1888 of The Secret Doctrine, announced to the Western world that metaphysics is not only alive, but essential to an understanding of our own nature and the nature of the universe. That there can be a synthesis, and this is her subtitle, a synthesis of science, philosophy, and religion that was not merely the emergence of a new truth, but constituted the very ground out of which these three areas of human concern could find their essential meaning. And I think when one begins to recognize why this was such a tremendous breakthrough. One can visualize it perhaps in this manner. I'm leaving the modes of thought for the moment, because this is the mode of thought then that now must pervade what to comprehend must pervade the consciousness. One could see then that there was science at one pole, religion at another pole, united by the speculations of philosophy. And from this could arise then a kind of synthesis that through philosophy could bring together science and religion. You see, this, but one could never really know that ultimate synthesis, that ultimate reality. It was non-experienceable. HPB comes along and says that all of these arise from a common source. And that this source is the secret doctrine, you see, out of which not from these arise a new synthesis, but that the synthesis is that which is the foundation. And so I picture it in this way. It's the foundation from which differing views of the universe arise. One looks at the universe from one point of view and it is science. From another point of view, it is religion. From another point of view, it is philosophy. But there is a source. And of that source, she says, yes, unknowable, but not non-experienceable. And here she breaks the stranglehold of Kantian philosophy and all that followed from it in the German transcendentalists, particularly Hegel, whose dialectic, as you know, led to what? Dialectical materialism, which has led to the communists, which was the influence on Marx, you see, which led, she saw, to a further materialism. And so she said, she called these volumes the synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy. Not in Hegelian terms or Kantian terms, but as that foundation, that root source from which they arise. Unknowable, but not non-experienceable. A tremendous, you can see why this really, and so, to answer those who had taken what Will Durant calls a pledge against metaphysics, HPB threw down the challenge. On page 51 of volume 1, the absolute consciousness, the European pantheists tell us, behind phenomena, which is only termed unconsciousness in the absence of any element of personality, transcends human conception. Unknowable, in other words, as I've just said. Man, unable to form one concept except in terms of empirical phenomena, is powerless from the very constitution of his being to raise the veil that shrouds the majesty of the Absolute. Only the liberated spirit is able to faintly realize the nature of the source whence it sprang and whither it must eventually return. Non-knowable, but not non-experienceable. And so she points, for example, to the Buddha, the enlightened one, whose very experience of it led to all of his teaching, as with every great world teaching. And consequently, the inherent part of the secret doctrine, and she goes on, as the highest Jnani Chohan, however, can but bow in ignorance before the awful mystery of absolute being. And since even in that culmination of conscious existence, the merging of the individual in the universal consciousness, to use a phrase of Fichte's, the finite cannot conceive the infinite, nor can it apply to it its own standard of mental experiences, how can it be said that the unconscious and the absolute can have even an instinctive impulse or hope of attaining clear self-consciousness? A Vedantin would never admit this Hegelian idea. Notice she uses the very individuals, you see, whose speculation is the groundwork of 19th century science and religion. Really. Fichte, Hegel, Kant, all of these. How can it be said that the Vedantin would never admit this Hegelian idea, and the occultist would say that it applies perfectly to the awakened Maha, the universal mind already projected into the phenomenal world as the first aspect of the changeless absolute, but never to the latter? Spirit and matter, or Purusha and Prakriti, are but the two primeval aspects of the one and secondless, we are taught. So we're clearly faced, therefore, with developing a new mode of thought, as I've already mentioned. There may be many ways to interpret HPB's statements on this question, but I think we begin to see the attitude that is necessary for understanding the esoteric philosophy. For the secret doctrine, when correctly studied, if I may suggest, produces a definite change in those who come to it with an open mind, a pure heart, an eager intellect, and unveiled spiritual perception, to quote HPB. The specific method which has been employed in writing the book brings out a particular faculty in the student, the faculty we call intuition, but which consists of a penetrative quality of mind, a penetration which brings direct insight. I think we can invite and develop this faculty, this new mode of thought. And it's easier today than it was a century ago, because today science is already making us familiar with paradox. Light can be both wave and particle. With process, and we've become really very much concerned with process, far more than with thingness. We know that everything in the universe is in process, is in constant motion. So it's much more, much clearer to us. But imagine what this was like, to say there is a synthesis which is not a new order of truth arising out of a reconciliation of opposites, but a synthesis that is the very grounding in which all speculation rests, in which there is a non-knowability, but a genuine experienceability. And that is why the central lesson of the secret doctrine, as many of you heard me say, live the life if you would come to the wisdom. It's a life, not just knowledge.
So this source is there.